It was supposed to be just another afternoon in the Oversight Committee office. Jasmine Crockett had a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and thorough, especially when it came to ethical reviews. That day, she had been assigned a stack of sealed materials related to travel reimbursements and external engagements connected to the previous administration. Most of it was routine, repetitive documents, mundane expenses, and overly redacted reports. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. But then she noticed something odd. In the middle of the pile was a large beige envelope with no federal markings. It was heavier than the others, almost as if someone had crammed more into it than it was meant to hold. It didn't have the standard seal either. No barcode, no clearance stamp, not even a return office label. It simply read, "Personal classified" in block letters. That phrase alone didn't match any government format she was familiar with. Curious, Jasmine set the other folders aside and opened it. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, not between government departments or contractors, but between a private account and someone whose name didn't show up in any federal database. The tone of the emails was intimate, filled with casual language, foreign phrases, and familiar expressions. It was obvious from the first few lines that this wasn't business. It was deeply personal. One side of the exchange was signed with a single letter V. Attached to the emails were travel logs, commercial flights, hotel reservations under false names, and strange payment trails routed through international banks. The dates lined up with official White House schedules, but the destinations didn't match the public records. What caught Jasmine's attention even more was that each trip coincided with weekends when Melania Trump had either been unavailable or resting, according to archived press briefings. As she flipped through the stack, she came across a photograph taken discreetly, clearly, without the subject's knowledge. It was in Prague, dated 2018. The woman in the photo wore large sunglasses, but her profile was unmistakable. Jasmine didn't need facial recognition software to know who it was. Standing next to her was a tall man, olive-skinned, sharply dressed, with a faint scar under his right eye. He didn't look like a bodyguard. He wasn't glancing around. He was laughing, leaning in closely, his hand just barely touching her back. Not possessively, but intimately. A gesture you couldn't fake. There was no name next to the man's face, just the same signature from the emails. V. Jasmine paused. She looked around the office, a quiet corner in a federal building with humming fluorescent lights and dusty windows. Nobody else had noticed her freeze. She flipped to the next page. More logs, more exchanges. A scanned handwritten note in cursive English, talking about how no one understands us like we do. It was signed M***. The envelope had no classified markings, but it had been slipped into a federal review file, intentionally or not. She couldn't tell. It wasn't supposed to be there. Someone had either been careless, or bold, or perhaps just desperate. Whatever the reason, Jasmine knew immediately that this wasn't gossip or political ammo. This was real, and powerful, and completely out of place in a pile of petty, bureaucratic records. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she reread the Prague itinerary. The record said the former First Lady was in New York that weekend, but the time-stamped hotel reservation and the photos told a different story. And there, buried near the back of the folder, was a note addressed to M, written in elegant handwriting that didn't match the blocky ink of the email printouts. The message was poetic, almost literary, ending with the phrase, "One day, they'll know I existed in your life." Jasmine checked the envelope again. No chain of custody, no recipient name, no clearance documentation. Someone had slipped this into federal hands, knowing someone like her would eventually open it. She didn't know yet who V was, but he was real. His presence had been tracked, photographed, and logged, and every page of that envelope pointed to a side of Melania that no one had seen before. The man was everywhere in the documents, yet nowhere in any official records. Jasmine Crockett found that odd. In the envelope she had uncovered, hidden among federal ethics review files, the name V appeared again and again, always in code, always at the edges of known timelines. But his presence was unmistakable. Whoever V was, he wasn't a political figure, not a diplomat, not a Secret Service agent or staffer, and yet, he had access. Deep, personal access to Melania Trump, and a closeness that couldn't be explained by mere coincidence. The emails between them didn't read like a traditional affair. They weren't full of passionate confessions or dramatic longing. They were subtle, intimate, full of shorthand that only two people who had spent serious time together would understand. "You never liked that place in Davos." One line read, "Next time, I'll choose better." There were references to quiet dinners, to walking unfamiliar city streets, and to moments described in a way that suggested not just romance, but a kind of emotional routine. The messages weren't reckless. They were careful, like they had practiced being invisible together. V seemed to be someone who moved with ease between continents. He wasn't tied down. He referenced Paris and Abu Dhabi in the same paragraph. His messages were time-stamped from places like Zurich, Vienna, and Baku. He never used a last name. His notes to Melania were almost always signed with that single letter V, nothing more. In one message, she called him my shadow in the daylight. In another, she thanked him for knowing when to vanish. Jasmine studied the photos next. The Prague image was the clearest. There was Melania, unguarded and casual, sipping something from a small cup, her face half-turned in conversation, and next to her, leaning in, was the same man, tanned, sharply dressed, with a narrow frame and a distinctive scar just beneath his right eye. His body language wasn't defensive or watchful like a bodyguard's. He was relaxed, familiar. There was a softness in the way he looked at her that suggested long history. Not a fling, but something more layered. Something that had existed. In parallel to the public life she led, the hotel logs confirmed more. V checked in under different names each time. Aliases like Vincent Dubois, Victor Z, or just Guest Z. But the last name never stayed the same, and the identification numbers were always foreign. Some were Belgian, some Swiss. One entry listed a Venezuelan passport, but Jasmine suspected it was fake. Yet the timeline was consistent. Every time Melania was off-grid, V appeared somewhere nearby. There was also a scan of a handwritten card, a note from V to M. The card was dated Valentine's Day 2019 and sent from an address in Florence, Italy. It read, I don't need to hold your hand in public. I hold your silence instead. You've always known how to speak without speaking. It was poetic in tone, but sharp in implication. Whoever he was, V understood discretion. Jasmine got the impression this man had been in her life for years, maybe, even before the White House. His pattern suggested someone practiced in remaining unseen. Someone whose life was lived beneath the surface of public scrutiny. One particularly strange discovery was a bank transfer, a $12,700 transaction from a Dubai-based firm to a Manhattan florist. The note attached read, for her windows there was no name attached. But the florist's receipt had a delivery address linked to Melania's personal suite in Trump Tower, a luxury bouquet of rare blue orchids, specially imported. Jasmine knew this wasn't the kind of gesture from a casual acquaintance. This was someone who knew what she liked, and what she would never publicly ask for. The deeper Jasmine went, the more the identity of V took shape, not in name, but in character. He was sophisticated, mobile, and untraceable. Fluent in more than one language, based on the phrases sprinkled throughout the emails, Italian, French, even a few Slavic expressions. A man who had mastered invisibility, but whose affection for Melania was documented across continents and years. He wasn't a whistleblower. He hadn't outed himself. In fact, nothing in the file suggested he wanted to be found at all. But his relationship with Melania was undeniable, and it had been coded into every line, every itinerary, every silent signature with that solitary V. When Jasmine Crockett discovered the envelope containing deeply personal documents connected to Melania and Trump and the mysterious man known only as V, she didn't immediately react. She wasn't the type to flinch or gasp in dramatic fashion. In fact, as she flipped through the pages, a blend of emails, hotel logs, coded messages, and surveillance-style photographs, her expression barely shifted. But those closest to her in that moment could tell something had changed. Her eyes, usually alert but measured, had narrowed, not in confusion, but in calculation. She read faster, and then slower. She circled back to certain lines, especially the ones where V had written with eerie precision phrases like you've never belonged to their world. Only survived it, and if they knew us, they'd destroy us. Not because it's wrong, but because it's ours. These weren't ordinary exchanges. These were the words of a man who understood the consequences of their relationship, and still chose to write them. Jasmine stayed silent for the first few seconds after realizing the gravity of what she'd found. But it didn't take long. One of her aides would later say it took exactly 36 seconds from the moment she finished reading the final page to when she spoke. And when she did, her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't angry. It was razor sharp and steady. Was this supposed to be buried? She asked, her tone so calm it cut the room in half. The question wasn't rhetorical. She asked it while looking directly at a staffer who had handed her the file. His eyes widened, but he said nothing. There was no response from anyone else, either just a quiet rustle of papers and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was one of those moments where no one wanted to be the first to speak, afraid that confirming anything might mean they'd seen too much or been complicit. Jasmine laid the envelope flat on the table and leaned back in her chair. Her fingers drummed once, slowly, on the edge of the document. Her expression was unreadable, not shocked, not impressed, not curious, controlled, as though she'd already shifted from discovery to decision-making. To those who didn't know her, the moment might have seemed small, just a woman reading documents and asking a simple question. But for the people in that office, staffers, aides, interns, even a few junior legal analysts, the atmosphere had changed instantly. Jasmine was a person who usually asked questions in structured ways, when there was a plan. But this time, her question came from instinct. Something was off, and now she wanted to know how it had gotten there. Asterisk, the presence of V was still haunting her as she sat there. His image, that one clear photo from Prague, lingered in her mind, not because he looked suspicious, but because he didn't. He looked like someone who knew exactly how to exist unnoticed. And yet, in this one moment, he'd been captured on paper, preserved, unintentionally or not, inside an envelope meant for eyes like hers. Asterisk, what struck Jasmine more than the romantic content was the precision of the relationship itself. V wasn't sloppy. He wasn't emotional in the typical way. Everything about him, his messages, his movements, even his silences pointed to a person who had planned carefully for a long time. The affection he showed for Melania was never loud, never public, but it was deep, and it was real. Asterisk, Jasmine wasn't reacting just to the shock value of the content. She had seen worse in politics. But what rattled her, if only slightly, was the clarity with which this man had lived in the shadows, maintaining a private life with someone constantly under public scrutiny. Melania hadn't just been hiding a secret, she had been maintaining a dual existence, and V had helped her build it. Asterisk, that realization stayed with Jasmine as she returned the documents to the folder, carefully closing it without comment. She didn't notify the media. She didn't walk out with outrage or panic. But inside her, the calculation had begun, not just about what she had found, but about who might have wanted her to find it, because nothing this precise shows up by accident, not in Washington, and especially not when it involves a woman like Melania and a man like V. After Jasmine Crockett discovered the contents of the misplaced envelope, Melo's travel records, photographs, and intimate notes that hinted at a secret relationship between Melania Trump and a man only referred to as V, she made a deliberate choice. Despite the magnitude of what she'd found, she didn't run to the press. She didn't call for an emergency meeting or leak anything to an anonymous source. She stayed quiet, measured, careful. To her, the silence mattered more than the shock. Documents weren't just scandalous, they were meticulously arranged, almost like someone had been waiting for the right person to find them. But even so, Jasmine knew the difference between discovery and exposure. She understood the weight of implication, and she understood that sometimes the most powerful message is the one left unspoken. Asterisk, later that day, standing at the lectern, in the House chamber, Jasmine delivered a floor speech. It wasn't on the docket, it wasn't scheduled, and it didn't name anyone. But to those listening carefully, it carried a charge that hadn't been there before. Asterisk, she spoke of ethics, of the lines between personal privacy and public trust, of the hypocrisy in holding only some people accountable while others operated behind sealed doors and false names. She never said Melania's name. She didn't have to. The speech was surgical, broad enough to pass as policy critique, yet precise enough that insiders knew exactly what inspired it. Asterisk, we speak often of transparency, she said, but what happens when the system itself teaches powerful people how to disappear in plain sight? Asterisk, that one line drew several heads upward. Asterisk, those who had read the briefings that week, or were in the know, understood the undertone. They knew about the rumors, the whispers of a man who had traveled under assumed identities, who had never once appeared in a security log, but somehow had been present in multiple foreign cities where the former First Lady had made unexplained appearances. A man who sent flowers to an apartment only her closest inner circle knew she still used. A man who signed every note with the same single letter, V. And still, Jasmine said nothing direct. The media noticed the speech, but they didn't fully grasp it. Headlines called it a sharp rebuke of hypocrisy in government and an abstract call for tighter ethics reform. But a few quiet figures on Capitol Hill knew better. They knew that something had been uncovered, something personal, delicate, and politically radioactive. Asterisk, Jasmine wasn't trying to create scandal. She wasn't interested in tabloid fame. What she was doing was drawing a line in the sand. She was signaling, in her own reserved way, that secrets, no matter how well constructed, would not remain protected by power alone. Asterisk, as for V, he remained a ghost. Asterisk, no one had seen him in official photographs. No name matched, yet the fragments told a story. A man with multiple identities, fluent in more than 3 languages, who never stayed in one place long enough to be questioned. He wasn't reckless. If anything, he had been loyal to Melania, to their shared privacy. The envelope Jasmine found hadn't come from him. It had likely been leaked by someone in the periphery, maybe an insider, maybe someone close who felt ignored or betrayed. But V himself? He had said nothing. Asterisk, the most haunting part of his presence was exactly that, his absence from every traditional channel. He was proof that in a world of surveillance, some still knew how to stay hidden. But Jasmine had broken that silence, not with names, not with accusations, just with the steady voice of someone who knew how Washington worked and how to press pressure points without touching them directly. Asterisk, in private, Jasmine continued her review of the documents. She catalogued the dates. She noted the timing, the moments when V was closest, Prague, Lake Como, Lisbon, all aligned with days when Melania was reportedly in private retreat or unavailable for press. And yet, there were no records of her security detail following her, nothing on the books. It was almost as if entire weekends had been wiped clean. Asterisk, the card from V. written in Italian and left unsigned, save for the letter V, lingered in her thoughts. La verità non ha bisogno di rumore. The truth doesn't need noise. Asterisk and Jasmine agreed. That's why she didn't leak a word. She simply stepped up to the podium, told the truth in code, and let the silence do the rest. Jasmine Crockett never intended to become the keeper of someone else's secret love story. But once she saw the contents of that envelope, saw the rhythm, the consistency, the care that had gone into hiding something so personal, she understood the responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just a scandal waiting to erupt. It was a quiet truth that had lived beneath the surface of American political life, undetected and deliberately concealed. She wasn't interested in weaponizing it, but she also wasn't about to let it vanish without consequence. Asterisk, what made the entire discovery even more powerful was the restraint she showed. In an era where political capital is often earned through loud disclosures and explosive leaks, Jasmine chose silence. Not because she was afraid, but because she respected the weight of what she had found. There was something more effective in letting the implication hang, a quiet echo in the halls of power where everyone thinks they know everything, and suddenly realize they don't. Asterisk, she never uttered the name V. She never published the images or the notes, but she forced everyone watching to ask the same question she had posed aloud the day she found it. Was this supposed to be buried? That question became a quiet ripple among committee staffers and behind closed doors. Not because they feared what Jasmine might do, but because they didn't know how many others might already know. Asterisk, and then there was him, the ghost in the documents. The man with no full name, but a signature as recognizable as any headline. V. Jasmine didn't know who he truly was, but she knew what he represented. A reminder that even in the most surveilled circles of public life, intimacy still finds a way. Secrecy isn't always sinister, it can be tender, protective, and sometimes, the truth doesn't explode into view. It surfaces in fragments, in footprints, in near misses, and silent admissions. Asterisk, that's what this story became. Not an exposed day, not an affair splashed across cable news, but a powerful question about what we protect and why. Jasmine didn't call for investigations or hearings. She didn't pursue Melania nor the man known as V. Instead, she held the truth gently, aware that sometimes revealing everything destroys more than it exposes. Her choice was not an action. It was intentional withholding, delivered with intelligence and poise. Asterisk, and in that decision, she made a louder statement than any scandal ever could. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be found and